Everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Thank you so much for being with us today. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of our committee, our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Today, we are going to start our program with a special tribute to our co-founder of America at a Crossroads, David Lehrer. Last October 25th, we received the shocking, unexpected news that David Lehrer died. At that time, Mel, Zev, and I paid tribute to our beloved partner, David, whose brilliance and vision was central to the creation of this America at a Crossroads series 5 years ago. Tonight, in recognition of David's first yahrzeit, that is the first anniversary of his passing, Mel, Zev, and I invited David's son, Eli, who will be honoring his father's memory by sharing some words of remembrance with us. Eli is the eldest of David and Ariella's 4 amazing children, all of whom were the source of great pride to David and, of course, to their mom, who's very much alive and with us. Eli is the executive vice president of the History Channel and has many accomplishments to his name. Tonight, he is here as a son, a brother, and a father, representing his family. Eli, we are so grateful that you are here with us tonight and look forward to your words of love, honor, and memory. Immediately following Eli's tribute, the program will go to Warren Olney, tonight's moderator, and to Jennifer Rubin, the brilliant Washington Post columnist. David admired Warren's skills as a journalist and as an interlocutor and always described Warren as a mensch. 5 years ago, David recruited Warren to America at a Crossroads, so it is apt that he's with us here tonight. We are grateful to Warren for being with us tonight. At David's suggestion, Jennifer was our very first America at a Crossroads guest 250 programs ago. That was certainly a reflection of David's affection and respect for Jennifer. We thought it apt for Jennifer to be our featured guest tonight on this, the first anniversary of David's passing. With that, in honor and in memory of our beloved David, whose living legacy is evident in this America at a Crossroads series, please welcome Eli Lehrer. Eli?
Thank you, Janice. One of my father's favorite quotes was the epitaph for the British architect Christopher Wren. On a small piece of stone in a corner of St. Paul's Cathedral, which Wren designed, it says simply, "If you would seek my monument, look around you." My father loved those lines deeply and would quote them all the time, and I've thought of them often during the past year. My father built many monuments across his 75 years. His family with a loving wife, 4 children, and 10 grandchildren. His professional life with 25 years running the Anti-Defamation League in Los Angeles and the work that continues to be done here at America at a Crossroads with Janice and Mel and Zev. His seemingly endless community of friends across Los Feliz and Los Angeles. Those are what I'm sure he'd consider his grandest achievements, his version of St. Paul's Cathedral. But as is the privilege of a child, I've been struck most this past year by the smaller monuments he left behind, the moments when I still feel his presence most acutely. Sometimes it's a simple thing, like when I'm reading a children's book he loved to my daughter, and I hear the text in his voice, or when I put on a Mozart sonata and it immediately conjures images of him laying on his couch on a weekend with the same classical music playing and his newspaper spread out next to him. Or the fact that anytime there's an exciting ending to a Lakers or a Dodgers game, I still expect a joyful text to appear on my phone asking if I watched it. But I suppose for the purposes of today, the most relevant moments when I often feel his spirit with me or in me are when there's something happening in the news, whether in Israel or Washington, D.C., and I'm able to remember his steadfastness and optimism. My father was a man who believed that people were imbued with what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, that the arc of the moral universe really did bend towards justice. He wasn't naive or simplistic. He had spent much of his life confronting anti-Semitism and extremism, but he fundamentally believed in the promise of America and that the world would be better tomorrow than it was today, in spite of however tumultuous today might seem. I think the work that America at a Crossroads continues to do, bringing people together to discuss the most important issues of our time, reflects the very best of what my father believed, that through dialogue and engagement, through civil debate and a recognition of our shared values and history, the inherent decency in people is revealed. There's always a million ways the news of the day conspires to make that seem like a delusion. But I found over the past year that one of my father's enduring gifts to me has been to never lose that fundamental faith in the world. And I hope that through the work that is done here on a weekly basis at America at a Crossroads, that same gift has been shared with some of you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Eli, and our sympathies, all of us here, to you and your family. Nobody could come up with a better description of David Lehrer than you just did. It was a wonderful tribute by a loving son to a father that is very much missed. I first knew David when I was a reporter, a television reporter, here in this very diverse world of Los Angeles. And whenever I needed a voice on behalf of civil rights or against hate and discrimination, the first person I wanted to talk to was David Lehrer. His advocacy was powerful and he was passionate. He was the kind of leader I think that this place really, really needs. I admired him immensely and we became friends. And I was thrilled and delighted when he invited me to be a part of this program. And I think all of us who are on it still regard it as, in an important way, a tribute to a man we all miss very much. I certainly miss him. And Eli, thank you again very much for your very moving conversation. Our guest tonight is Jennifer Rubin. She's a political commentator and columnist for the Washington Post. We all know that. She has worked at Commentary, PJ Media, Human Events, The Weekly Standard. Her work has been published in Politics, the New York Post, the New York Daily News, the National Review, the Jerusalem Post. In 2020, she announced she's no longer a conservative, and she wrote a book called Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. Jennifer Rubin, always good to talk with you. Thanks for joining us.
Jennifer,
I think you're muted.
You'd think after all these years I had figured that out. Thank you so much. I actually declared in 2020 that I was not a Republican. I still think that I have conservative inclinations. But thank you for having me. And I still think of David often. When I was a young lawyer in Los Angeles, he was heading the ADL, and I just thought he was the personification of decency, of public service. And when he decided to begin this with Zev and Mel and Janice, I thought, gosh, what an optimistic view that people would be interested in substance, that people would tune in to listen for and ask questions for an hour. And I thought, well, I guess people will be somewhat entertained during COVID, but I expect this will burn out after a little while. But his optimism and faith that if you give people intelligent conversation and debate, they will enjoy it, they will come, sustains me when I look at the current state of our political discourse and think, you know, we all have to keep our game high. We all have to raise our game because people will come if we play to their better angels, as Eli eloquently said.
Well, thank you for that. And let us get underway and try to provide the service that all of us, I think, thank David for giving us the opportunity to do. In July of this year on a television panel, you said this. You said, "We are on the brink of going down the road to dictatorship. That's more important than anything else we're doing in, excuse me, we're in 1933, not 1938. We have the chance to stop the train." So that was in July. We're now exactly 2 weeks from the November election. Is the train being slowed down a bit, or are we closer to 1938?
I think we're still in equipoise. The jury is still out. And it never fails to amaze me that we are this close, that when we have two candidates, one who is more unhinged by the day, more crude, more vulgar, more threatening, more angry on one side, who openly talks in Hitlerian terms. And just today we read in the Atlantic Monthly that he admired and wanted to have Hitler's generals. When we have that on one side, and on the other hand, a woman who is immensely qualified for office, who speaks with great affection and respect for the traditions of America, for the values of America, it is still remarkable to me that it is a close election. And I have wrestled with this realization that we have millions upon millions of people who, for one reason or another, which we can discuss, are attracted, not repelled by Donald Trump. But in echoing the optimism of David, I still think we will find our footing, and I remain optimistic. You know, yesterday was interesting. It was a very American Crossroads kind of day because Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris made 3 appearances in 3 different cities, in 3 different swing states. And they had a conversation, an actual conversation with long answers and back and forth, and discussing why we need a president who has values, why we need a president who understands America's mission in the world, its devotion to democracy. And there was a moment I thought that was so telling when one of the questioners from the audience asked a Dobbs-related question. And Liz Cheney, who has been a pro-life person her entire life, said, you know, there's something very wrong if we are now in a situation where women are not getting the care they need, and we need to change that. And I thought, wow, we have 2 adult people who can calmly and factually discuss an issue and maybe somewhere find some common ground. And I thought Kamala Harris's response was remarkable. She said, whether you believe it or not, that perhaps many Republicans didn't understand the real ramifications of Dobbs. Whether she believed it or not, she was opening the door. She was telling her opposition, you can come back. We can have a discussion. Now that the facts are in, let's talk this over. And that was the best of American politics, where 2 intelligent people can have such dialogue, can perhaps reach some common understanding, and if not, at least leave respectful and even admiring of one another. And I thought it was quite a remarkable day.
Is it also risky for her to travel with Liz Cheney and associate herself with somebody who is so much a Republican, so deeply a Republican of the traditional variety, granted, obviously, as opposed to Donald Trump?
Well, it's interesting. Jim Messina, who ran Barack Obama's successful 2012 campaign, was recently interviewed, and he said, my party has this stupid, though he didn't use the word stupid, he used another word, idea that you can only appeal to your base or you can only appeal beyond your base, and you have to do both. And that's, I think, what she has been able to do. She has attended innumerable events and had interviews with outlets that directly reach into constituencies that have long been important to the Democratic Party, African Americans, young people, Hispanics. She just did 2 massive church appearances in Atlanta on Sunday. So she's not neglecting the people who brought her to the dance, as it were, nor is she shaving her agenda, which is quite ambitious, which is quite progressive. But at the same time, that does not mean that she has to spur and demean and close out Republicans who are still willing to engage in intelligent dialogue. She's pledged to put a Republican in her cabinet. She says she wants to have a kind of advisory council, a bipartisan one that can make some policy recommendations. And she stressed that she's a pragmatic person, that she wants to get things done. And I don't think she loses points doing that. I really don't. I think her base knows what her agenda is. She's been clear. She's been remarkably specific, despite complaints that she hasn't. She has been a progressive. No one can really, I think, question those credentials. But she is also telling Republicans like I used to be a Republican, that there's a place for you, that if you really love this country, if, for example, foreign policy is very important to you, which it is and always has been to me, there is a place for you. And I think that's to her credit, that you can do both. And we'll see. We'll see how many Republican votes she gets. We'll see what the turnout is like in just a couple of weeks. But I think it's possible. That, frankly, is what Barack Obama did. He was able to consolidate the Democratic base and then pull in a lot of people who had not voted for Democrats in the past.
It's said that the voters won't change, and there are a lot of polls that indicate that that's the case. She's had a hard time differentiating herself from the Biden administration, of which, of course, she has been a major part. Is this race really becoming Donald Trump versus the status quo rather than Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris?
I don't think so. And I think she's answered the question, which she's been asked now several times, in a very appropriate way, which is, I'm my own person. I bring different experiences. I bring a different geographic background. I bring a different family background. And of course, the country is fundamentally in a different place than it was when Joe Biden took office. She doesn't have to tackle a pandemic. She doesn't take office if she wins in the middle of a deep recession. She is much further along in job creation, in infrastructure building, in some important measures on green energy than Biden was, because he laid the foundation. He was remarkably successful. So she can then turn to other issues, which she has outlined. And I have to say, she is a different kind of Democrat from Joe Biden. And that's not merely because they're of a different generation. I like to say that he is a Scranton Democrat and she is a Silicon Valley Democrat. And what does that mean? It means that she is very adept and attuned to a new economy. She is much more inclined to cooperate and encourage the private sector and entrepreneurialism, and that's reflected in many of her policies. She also comes as a prosecutor, and she has given speeches and made statements and released policies that 20 years ago, a responsible Republican could have given, that the border must be secure, that we are a country of laws, that we can do this humanely, but we must do it. And she has also flexed her muscles as someone who's been a prosecutor. So she comes across, I think, as much more muscular in many respects. And because Trump is such an isolationist and such a patsy for dictators, she also comes across as much more of a hawk than he does. And she has used that. So she has a very interesting blend of arguably more progressive policies than Biden had advanced, but also from the standpoint of independents, Republicans, a much tougher exterior, a much more combative approach towards America's enemies. And I think you have to take her at her word. And I wonder if there's a little bit of sexism. No one asked Joe Biden, how are you different than Barack Obama? It was just assumed, oh, well, he's his own guy. It's a different time. He has his own record. So I think the same is true of her. And no one can say we're the same country that we were 4 years ago. Somehow Trump has convinced his followers that we were better off in the midst of the pandemic and the recession, but we were certainly in a different place than we are now.
Trump Republicans will take the very things that you just mentioned and say that, well, she's just trying to have both sides of every issue, and we really don't know where she stands at all.
She's been pretty clear. She hasn't taken the mushy middle. She hasn't said, well, I want to do something about housing, but I'm too concerned about the deficit, so maybe I'll just do a little something. She's been pretty clear and pretty bold. I've made a small career out of lately of advocating what I call centrism. And that is not the mushy middle, not the halfway point, but the willingness to be eclectic, to borrow the best from both sides. And if she is borrowing a page from Republicans of a generation ago when it comes to border security, national security, and she is also willing to promote a industrial policy that is much more engaged in a government role for economic growth and economic advancement, then she really is kind of a different bird. And I don't think it's simply compromising halfway on each issue. I think in many respects it's borrowing, but her policies are pretty bold and pretty straightforward, I think.
You've been very tough on the media, and you have said they have done an abominable job of prioritizing what's important and what's not. How have they failed, and to what extent has that made things easier for Trump?
Well, it certainly has made things easier for Trump. Let me say that it is not easy to cover Donald Trump. Every day is a decade with him. That there are so many remarkable, horrific, unprecedented things that it is easy to get inundated, easy to get inured to the insanity of it all. And to keep on your toes, to keep a clear-eyed view that this is an abomination, that this is not how American democracy operates, is a tough thing to do. I also think that the media still has not figured out how to cover Donald Trump. Virtually everyone who was trained as a journalist, certainly the editors, reporters who came up before Donald Trump was on the scene, learned a style of journalism, which was you present an argument from one side, you present the argument for the other. Maybe you find an expert from one side, an expert from the other. I don't have to tell you, you were one of the great reporters, and you presented a complete balanced picture, which frankly wasn't difficult because there was an agreed upon set of facts and people had different reactions, different solutions to the problems. That is not what we have now. We have someone who constantly lies. We have someone who is reneged on the Democratic compact, who has tried to overthrow an election once before. We just had the head of PolitiFact who says, you know, I've kind of been hiding the ball from you people. I haven't been telling you how we keep track of who has more lies. And he basically came clean and said, it's overwhelming the Republicans. There's simply no comparison. So how do you cover a race without appearing biased when there is such a division between truth-telling, between common decency, between the candidates? And I don't think they have come to a satisfactory result. And often what they have done until recently, and I think there has been a change in the last couple of weeks, is they have what we call sane washed him, which is they will listen to one of these jagged, incoherent speeches and try to find something in there that makes sense, that sounds like an argument, and run a headline like Donald Trump argues for stronger border policy. Because at least that was coherent. At least you can find 5 or 6 words that are strung together that have a complete thought. And so that's what they've been doing. But of course, that disguises the insanity that surrounds it. That disguises how mean-spirited, how discoordinated, all the diversions and the rambling. So that had not, I think, really come through in the way and the degree it should have. And I understand you were in television. You don't want to put up 2 minutes of somebody babbling incoherently. You know, the audience will tune out or think you're nuts for playing it. So how do you communicate that level of insanity, frankly, to audiences. And I think a couple things have happened in the last couple of weeks. One, Kamala Harris did something very smart. She started playing clips of Donald Trump at her own rallies. And that really kind of forced the media to cover it. They're covering her. And it's pretty unusual, unprecedented, I think, to show clips of your opponent at your own events. So they began covering it. And she began being much more outspoken about the fact that he's unhinged, he's unstable, he's unfit. And she kind of goaded the media a bit into playing this out. And I think the other thing that happened is he has gotten worse. And I think since the debate and since the, frankly, reviews of the debate, he has become more frenetic, more unhinged, more emphatic about his lies. And you can understand why. He may well lose an election and then face criminal prosecution. I had an interview today. I love being on the other side, by the way, Warren. I love what you guys do. I was on the other side of an interview today, interviewing the two authors of a marvelous book called Lucky Loser about Donald Trump's really kind of fake empire, and that he was really made into a billionaire by a $400 million inheritance and then The Apprentice. And what they explained is that it's the appearance of Donald Trump and the narrative that he has sort of brought to this election is so fixed in the public's mind that it is very hard, although necessary, to combat that, to push back against the sense that he's some kind of economic genius, that he's built this magnificent empire, that he must be smart because he has put together all these businesses. So I think it's a tough task. I think the last few weeks have been better, but I think they still haven't quite figured it out. And I think the best that I have heard from this, and from some of the media critics like Margaret Sullivan, like Jay Rosen, like others, is that you have to be on the side of truth. And if one side is very deficient when it comes to truth, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles. And that's what you have to present to the American people. Otherwise, you're making Donald Trump's job a whole lot easier, and you're really not conveying what's going on in the actual race with the American people.
It seems to me it's also difficult for political reporters because Trump is essentially running against the system, and the reporters are all part of the system. So there's no tradition for that. There's no way to talk about it. It's very difficult. And as they say, only until quite recently have people been pointing that out and making that more clear. And I'm interested, we started out talking about the idea that we were moving toward a dictatorship. What does that mean? You say that's the most important thing that we have to deal with. What would a Trump dictatorship look like?
Well, he's told us in large part. He said that he wants to round up 11, 12, however many million people, put them in camps, and then deport them. And if you think that's going to be limited to illegal immigrants, I think you're mistaken. He's already shown his venom towards legal immigrants, for example, those who are on a temporary visa. That is going to take an enormous police state, an enormous amount of surveillance. That is frightful. And when he doubles down and talks about issuing numbers to people, that really does drum up images of a Nazi-like sweep. He has said that he thinks he can suspend the Constitution. He says he thinks that he wants to be or can be a dictator on day one. He has recently said again, I'm going to use a lot of power in office. He has not presented an agenda that would include Congress in any of this. He's talked about what he will do with a stroke of the pen. In his foreign policy, he's identified not with our democratic allies, but with dictators, and with aggressive dictators like Putin, like Xi, like Kim Jong-un. So it is a very different conception of America and of the presidency. And I will say the Supreme Court has made this a bit worse by and not only in the immunity case, but in cases before that, really allowing the executive to acquire enormous areas of power that Congress, frankly, used to play a much greater role in. And when they, for example, upheld his Muslim ban, that was an extraordinary act of unilateral power, aside from the fact it was discriminatory and hateful and ineffective. And the Supreme Court simply rubber stamped it. And then they went on this term, as everyone knows, to essentially give him wide latitude with the knowledge that he won't be criminally prosecuted. So you have someone who has said that he wants to pursue these policies, that he wants to convert the federal workforce into his own private sort of loyalists, going back to, I guess, the days of Tammany, that he wants to radically reshape the Justice Department, that it would respond personally to him and he would control prosecutions and go after his enemies. New York Times today just documented over 100 threats he's made against individuals and companies. So when you put this all together, I think we should believe him. I think we should stop assuming that it's an act or that he's not going to do these things. After all, when he was last in power, did the most authoritarian thing one can imagine, and that is he refused to recognize the results of a free and fair election. And we should remember, when he returns this time, if he returns this time, God willing he won't, that the General Millleys, the General Kellys, the Mark Espers, the people who are speaking out now and warning us that he is fascist to the core will not be there. They're all out. He will have facilitators, enablers. There will be no guardrails. And I think there is real reason to be very, very worried about what kind of power he will exercise and what his aims are.
You've mentioned this a couple of times, and you've written that if Trump should lose, there's been a lot of talk about what you refer to as catastrophic consequences, because the Republicans have been working on ways that they could use to overturn the results. Your column yesterday suggested you're not all that worried about that. You don't think that's necessarily going to happen.
I think there's a distinction. I think we should be prepared and worried about a full-on assault. The Trump forces have already filed over 100 lawsuits. There's not been a single vote that's been cast. And they are trying to defend other unilateral moves that would either, one, suppress the vote, make it harder for people to vote, taking away drop boxes, taking away access, or suggesting that certifying the results, which is a ministerial obligatory function, would somehow be optional, and that there could be local officials or governors or whomever that would simply say, no, I'm not going to recognize that Kamala Harris won this race. So we should not be confused that he will try this. He is already spreading the lie that illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, are voting. This is false. There has never been evidence of this. But he's doing it in order to prep the country, as he did last time, to dispute an election. But when you step back and say, well, what could stop him? There, I think we should have a little bit more caution and a little bit more confidence. In all of these lawsuits that he's been filing, he's been losing. And I would point to a recent decision in Georgia in which it was a unanimous decision not to allow a screwy rule to go forward that would have made certification optional and would have required that they hand count ballots, which is about the most inaccurate and mischief-making way to tabulate votes. So it's not like he can simply do these things. In a court of law, unlike Fox News, you have to bring the facts. You have to bring the evidence. He lost 60 cases last time. That's why he eventually resorted to strong-arming Mike Pence and, frankly, drumming up violence, because he failed. because in courts, you have to have some basis for these allegations. And unless you actually believe that there will be millions of illegal votes cast, and we have no reason to believe that is remotely possible, he's not going to pull it off. Now, people have said, yeah, but what about Bush v. Gore? In other words, what if it comes down to a single state and a few hundred votes? Could this Supreme Court tip it to Trump? I don't want to give them the shot. That is a frightful prospect. And the fact that I cannot, in good conscience and with absolute certainty, say no, they will play it straight. They won't allow him to overcome a deficit if it's 100 votes, if it's 1,000 votes, if it's 100,000 votes. I frankly don't have an enormous, overwhelming, unquestioned degree of confidence. Do I think that there are at least 4 votes to prevent that? I do. Do I think that the Supreme Court would be nuts to try to pull that off? I do. But I tend to think that we're not going to have a second black swan event in our lifetimes, another once in a generation, once in a country's history election in which it's one state and it's 500 some odd votes. We are likely to have what we had last time. And if you take the poll seriously, I think it's reflected that we will have 5, 6, 7 states that are very close. But there will be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of votes like there was in 2020. And when you do that, it's just not possible to steal an election. Our system is so decentralized. We do have responsible judges in the lower courts, and you need facts. You need the evidence. And I would say one other thing, and that is that the Justice Department is not in Trump's hands this time. It's in adult hands, it's in responsible hands. You're not going to have a Justice Department tasked with coming up with screwy excuses to disregard or overturn electoral votes. You're not going to have a Jeffrey Clark inside the Justice Department making mischief. So there are protections, there are backstops. We should take the threat very seriously. And I was pleased to find out myself and then see confirmed in reporting from the New York Times that the Harris campaign has hundreds of lawyers, hundreds and thousands of pre-written briefs anticipating what's going to happen. They are not naive. They are not going to be caught unaware. So I think once we have a declared winner, if it is Kamala Harris, the responsible thing for the media and for the public to do is to consider the election concluded, to reaffirm we have a president-elect, and whatever shenanigans Trump runs through, to keep in mind that does not make the election in dispute. It does not make the election illegitimate. It simply means Donald Trump, once again, is trying to overthrow the will of the people. So it's a very long answer to your question. And I think the bottom line is they're certainly going to try, but it's very, very hard to pull off.
Okay, let's hope all those Democratic lawyers don't get into arguments with one another. We've got a lot of questions on chat. Let's see if we can get as many of them in as we can. Marilyn from Pennsylvania says this on CNN. They just did a piece on the Jewish vote in Pennsylvania. The Republican Jewish coalition is putting millions of dollars into getting Jews to vote Republican here in Pennsylvania, and it might sway the election. I know people who are Democrats changing to vote for Trump because of Israel. What do you think we can say?
I think when we have seen actual polling, the numbers have been overwhelmingly Democratic, that there really has been no shift from the percentage of American Jews who vote for this Democratic nominee as opposed to the last Democratic nominee. And on the other side of the equation, of course, we've never had a nominee that has been this virulently anti-Semitic. Whether it comes to echoing Hitlerian language or it comes to blaming the Jews in anticipation of a defeat. I think there are as many Jews who are extremely worried, extremely concerned. And I think, once again, she will overwhelmingly take the Democratic vote. Listen, we are in, I don't have to tell this audience, we are in a fraught time in the Middle East and with Israel. And there are people on both sides that will not vote for someone if they're supporting Israel and will not vote for someone if they are supporting Israel. And yes, there are small numbers of those people who will come to the conclusion, wrongly, I think, that she somehow is not supportive of Israel. Her record says otherwise, her history says otherwise, her rhetoric says otherwise, but they may choose to vote for Donald Trump. But there is always a segment of Republicans who are Jewish, and they're outvoted. And frankly, I think that tells the rest of American Jewry, you better turn out in numbers. You better turn out and vote because much is at stake. And there is nothing more important, as this audience knows, to the survival and the well-being of the Jewish people than the rule of law, than democracy, than an executive who must operate within the confines of the law. So I think the outcome will not be very much different than it has been in past elections.
Mina asked this, do you think the situation in the Middle East will cause Harris to lose Michigan?
No, I don't. And in fact, from what I've seen from the early voting, it is there has been enormous turnout from Democrats in the early voting. That's a fraught game looking at those votes because you don't know who's going to vote on election day. You don't know how much is being cannibalized from election day, although there's some helpful evidence that it's actually Republicans who are cannibalizing the vote rather than Democrats. So there's nothing to suggest that that is the case. And I think one of the reasons that Kamala Harris has spent so much time in Michigan is that while there is a significant Arab American population there, there's a huge African American population. There is a considerable Jewish American population, and I think she will prevail. Michigan has changed in the last few years. They have a Democratic governor, they have a Democratic Secretary of State, they have a Democratic Attorney General, they have a Democratic legislature. It has turned blue to a much larger extent than it was. So I think she starts from a stronger position than Biden did, and I think she will prevail in Michigan.
Here's a question from E.A. Smith in Santa Paula, California. Do you agree with Neil Katyal, the Supreme Court expert and constitutional expert, his recent assessment of what to expect from this election, no matter what he says, that he fears that Trump's repeat of all this election interference, even violence like January 5th, his shenanigans, as they're called, starting on November 5th, all over the U.S., not just in swing states. I'm sorry if this is a little bit rambling question, but I think the points are clear enough. And whether Harris wins or not, Trump and his corrupt GOP cronies in Congress and elsewhere will steal the election from him. I think the idea that there will be violence, that it seems in some cases almost inevitable, is something worth talking about.
I don't agree with Neil. He's a fine lawyer, but in this case, I think we part company. In fact, the column that you made reference to kind of goes through the points that he made one by one. The issue of violence, however, is a real one. And Trump has been shameless in his willingness to instill violence, to suggest that violence is an appropriate remedy. He's lionized the January 6th criminals who killed and maimed police officers. It is a frightful situation that we have a major party who is willing to engage in such rhetoric and such waving of the bloody flag. I would keep in mind two things. One, again, the national security apparatus, the police forces, the FBI are much better prepared this time than they were last time. And they have been working, in close coordination with local police to make sure that they respond. For example, January 6, 2025, when they will open the electoral votes, has been declared a national security event, meaning they have the highest level of alert, the highest level of surveillance. So I think that if they do try something, that the response will be prompt and effective. And I think in this regard, although I've certainly been critical of Merrick Garland, a lot of the people who put together the violent uprising are in jail or have been prosecuted, and they've been taken off the playing field, as it were. So it's not easy to repeat that. And I don't rule out the possibility that there will be small incidents. By the way, the fact that you have to ask this question and I have to be concerned, and we all do, is still unfathomable to me. This is the United States of America. Until 2020, January 2021, we never imagined that it would come to violence. And that is one of the horrible legacies of Donald Trump and this MAGA movement, that he has tamed and normalized violence. And when we get through this election, if we get through this election with our democracy intact, I think there has to be a bipartisan, across the aisle, rethinking of the kind of rhetoric and the kind of language and activity that we have seen from Donald Trump. We cannot go on like that as a democracy.
Peaceful transition of power is the most important aspect of democracy, it seems to me.
Exactly.
So Dave has this question. What are the chances of a foreign player getting involved in the election in various nefarious ways, tipping the election to Trump in some way, since it appears to be so close?
Well, we already know that they're at it again. We already know that the Russian bots and the Chinese bots are at it. We just learned that a kind of social media rumor that Governor Tim Walz had abused a student came from the Chinese. So they're already at it. And I think, unfortunately, we have come to realize that we live in an environment in which bad actors from outside the United States do try to influence our elections. And I think the only thing we can do is implore people to look at social media critically, to not click and forward everything they see, to think through whether something is plausible, realistic, and to restrain themselves. And the fact, frankly, that we have Twitter in the hands of Elon Musk makes this innumerably worse, exponentially worse, because, of course, he is a Trump official, a Trump enabler, and is responsible for spreading and amplifying a lot of this. And that should be of great concern.
Just paging through here. Kelly wants to know, why are John Kelly, Mattis, the former
yes,
chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, H.R. McMaster and others, warning voters more publicly that Trump is not fit to serve and is a threat and is the real enemy of within, as Kelly puts it?
Well, the good news is that Kelly has spoken up. He was interviewed by Jeffrey Goldberg from Atlantic, and he was also interviewed by the New York Times. And he has confirmed the previous reporting that Trump referred to generals as and people who had served as suckers and losers, that he couldn't fathom any understanding of why people would give their lives for their country. He did come out and actually confirm that. And he did say that he believes, and he read off a little definition of fascism and says he thinks Trump meets the bill. And Milley has said the same thing in his conversation with Bob Woodward in terms of saying that Trump is fascist to the core. Now, could more of them have spoken out, and could they have spoken out sooner and with more detail? Absolutely.
And publicly.
And it still amazes me that we had young 20 and 30 some odd, women who were low-level White House aides who came forward to warn the country and testify before Congress. And you have 50, 60-year-old retired generals who are hiding under their desk. It's really terrible commentary on their lack of civic responsibility. And I think it's worth reflecting on what they think they are accomplishing by keeping such a low profile. I am pleased to see, though, that we do have a couple of these figures coming forward. And I would also say we should really give credit to those Republicans who have come forward. It's not only Liz Cheney. Kamala Harris appeared at Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania, with 100 or so of the Republican operatives, former aides, national security people who are supporting her. So there have been some, but is it distressing that for so many, party still takes precedent over a country? Yes, it is. And it's a very sad, sad commentary on the state of today's Republican Party.
Linda wants you to talk about the involvement of Elon Musk and his possible role in the Trump administration, if there is one.
You know, he is a malicious force in politics. He has been spreading the same disinformation. He has been amplifying it. He has changed his algorithms to elevate disinformation and to suppress other information. He is essentially bribing people now by handing out millions of dollars if people show that they are registered. He has spent tens of millions of dollars trying to get Trump elected. So if there were ever an indication of the really vile place of dark money in politics, this is it. And he is a malicious force. And when you consider that Trump will be literally indebted to this guy and he will have an outsized role in a Trump administration, that should give us pause for concern. And I think it once again behooves us to look at the way our politics is funded and to ask why we have allowed a system to grow up in which a billionaire can effectively try to buy an election. And that is a long-term problem. The Supreme Court decision holding that money is speech has been a pernicious force. And I think we need to think long and hard about how we get a handle on this.
Seems to me there's another issue because Musk, as I understand it, I hope I have my numbers right, received $15 billion from the federal government over the past 10 years, yes. And he's in charge of the space program. They can't go into space without consulting with him. He also has an enormous role in the intelligence operation because he controls the satellites. How important is that? And if he becomes a member of the Trump administration, isn't there an enormous conflict?
It is. It is an absolute frightful fact. And the fact that we have become so dependent upon one individual, one company, gives one pause. And I think we need to go back and look at how it is that we have put our national security and our space program really at the whim of a single malicious individual. It's like something out of a James Bond movie, that the evil genius is now in charge of, satellites. So I don't envy the next administration, if it's Kamala Harris, to try to figure out how to contain his influence, how to get other contractors up to speed, and to try to correct this horrendous dependence that we now have on Elon Musk.
What's your assessment of Project 2025, and how important do you think it might be to Trump if, in fact, he wins the election?
I think it's extremely important. And although Trump may not have read it, he doesn't read anything. The people around him have read it. And certainly J.D. Vance, who we haven't gotten a chance to talk about, who is as malicious and duplicitous as they come, has read about it and has talked about various aspects. And it's really a frightful document. It's not simply, and I say not simply, that he wants to really eradicate the civil service. It is a blueprint for turning the country into a Christian nationalist state. The redefinition of family, the use of the federal government to promote a certain kind of family, a heterosexual couple with children, the contempt, frankly, that J.D. Vance shows towards women is a frightful step back. And when you look at the rest of it, it's a recipe for taking us back to a government that is sort of pre-New Deal, in which there was not serious regulation of many industries, in which the federal government essentially allowed big and powerful forces to do what they will. And when you talk about excising huge chunks of the government, and when you talk about screwy schemes like politicizing the Federal Reserve, that's heady stuff. And you can tell yourself, oh, it's so crazy, he's not going to put any of it into practice. But if he wins, do we really not think he'll consider himself invincible? Do we really not think he will try these things? Do we really not think he'll feel indebted to the right-wing ideologues who set him up? I think there's grave risk for worry, and it's really a recipe both for chaos and for a type of theocratic government that represents a threat to not just Jewish Americans, but people of all faiths and people who have no religious faith.
This is sort of a morbid question, but Trump has, I think you indicated earlier, been looking very tired of late. The issue of age has been raised. He's 78 and was going to be considerably older. He'd be the oldest person ever elected to the presidency if he wins. That does, it seems to me, put a focus on J.D. Vance.
Yeah, it really does. And, a number of my readers have actually said, shouldn't we be paying more attention to J.D. Vance with a guy who is at the top of the ticket, who seems this, physically taxed and who certainly is mentally not all there? And I think that's right. I think we need to understand that Trump, it's very easy to imagine that if he gets elected, either that he wouldn't finish the term or he would act sort of as a figurehead. All he wants to do is have the trappings of the presidency. He never liked doing the job of presidency. All he wants is the presidency and the ability to, visit revenge and punishment on his enemies. And, there's a scene in the movie Vice, which is a sort of a parody of the Bush administration, where Cheney is sitting there saying, I'll take a lot of stuff off your table. Energy, international affairs. And he goes through these enormous chunks of government. And granted, it's a parody. And Bush says, yeah, sure, that sounds like a good idea. You can imagine that conversation happening for real with J.D. Vance, that he will aggregate unto himself large chunks of the responsibility of actually running government. Trump's not going to do it. He never has.
Rona wants to know, has the addition of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to the Trump campaign made any difference, do you think, in attracting voters?
I don't think so. I think he's become such a really reviled, bizarre figure that he has lost influence. Listen, if there was anyone who doubted Trump's sanity, the fact that he would enlist Robert Kennedy and reference him as someone who knows a lot about healthcare, as he did recently, should really scare you. This guy is a full-on conspiracy nut, a terrible embarrassment, unfortunately, to the Kennedy family. And it just goes to show you, this is the type of person who is attracted to Trump and who Trump is attracted to. The best and the brightest do not go for Trump. The people who have high moral standards and high levels of expertise do not want to be involved with Donald Trump. So you get crackpots and kooks and disreputable people.
What do you think is the situation in Gaza, in Lebanon, and that part of the world now how is it going to affect the campaign, or how is it likely to affect the campaign? Do you think that there will be any efforts there by anybody to try to institute some sort of October surprise?
Well, I think there was initially some hope, some expectation that with Sinwar killed, with Hezbollah's leader Nasrallah killed, with a great deal of Hezbollah wiped out, that there might be an opportunity to push through for some kind of ceasefire, some kind of deal that would end, at least temporarily, the fighting. I think that is proving to be less tenable than people had hoped. When I look at Benjamin Netanyahu, I see someone who frankly wants to wait it out and see what the results of the American election are. he knows that if Donald Trump is elected, he will have free reign to really satisfy his right wing, whether it's annexation, whether it's continuing a war, whether it's some of his more draconian domestic schemes like lessening the independence of the judiciary. And if Kamala Harris wins, he'll be under more pressure to bring things to a conclusion. So unfortunately, I don't see anything happening in the next couple of weeks. And for better or worse, foreign policy simply does not drive presidential elections. You will see how little time, frankly, the candidates are spending on foreign policy these days. And although it should take a bigger role, and frankly, Trump's willingness to throw our Democratic allies into the arms of Putin should be a disqualifying factor in and of itself, it's generally a domestic-driven presidential race.
Let me interrupt you just briefly because we're almost out of time. And David Lehrer always asked when I was a interrogator, and I think he asked others as well, to try to find if you can get something optimistic at the end of the program and leave people with a
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm optimistic on two scores. First of all, early voting has been very strong. People are turning out to vote. They are not disillusioned. They are invested in the election. And that's a really good sign. And the other thing that gives me hope, and I've said it before, and it's even more so now, is although they come in for a lot of grief, the Gen Z generation gives me faith. This is the best educated, the most tolerant, the most technologically sophisticated people and generation that we've had, the best read generation. And if we can just stumble our way through the next, 15, 20 years and hand it off to them and have the democracy still intact, I think we'll be just fine. So I think long-term, our prospects are good. And we just need to really make this an election that is a referendum on what kind of country and what kind of people we are. And I think if people take it seriously and they understand the magnitude of the threat that Donald Trump poses, I think we'll be okay.
Jennifer Rubin, in the spirit of David Lehrer, thank you so very, very much, as always. It's wonderful to talk with you, and I always enjoy it a lot, and I know that the audience does as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Warren. It's always lovely to talk to you.
Okay. That's it. Next up is on October 28th is Celinda Lake and Paul Maslin with Mandolin Brand. So be sure to listen to that, and there are other programs coming up as well, including Ann Applebaum with Larry Mandel. I'm Warren Olney. Thanks a lot for joining us at America at a Crossroads, and we'll do it again.